Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin in the name of God, the Almighty, the most merciful and the most compassionate. Thank you all for joining us today, and apologies for the little glitch in starting. But I just wanted to say Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be on everyone, and welcome to our program today, Prison Rebellion and Resistance, a discussion with Dr. Walaa Quisay and Dr. Orisanmi Burton. My name is Shireen Youssef, and I'm a volunteer with Believers Bailout, and I am incredibly humbled to introduce you to the speakers and facilitators for this event. But before we begin, I just wanted to offer a little more information about Believers Bailout for folks that are joining us for the first time. Believers Bailout is a community-led organization that uses zakat, or a religious-based charity tax within the Islamic tradition, to bail out Muslims from pretrial and immigration incarceration across the United States. Based in Chicago, home to the largest single-site jail in the United States, Believers Bailout supports efforts to abolish money bail and to raise awareness within Muslim communities on the injustices of the bail bond system, immigration bonds, and the broader prison industrial complex of which they form part. Sorry about that. Okay, so while cash bail was eliminated in Illinois in 2023 through the Pretrial Fairness Act, BBO continues to expand their work in bailing out Muslims in pretrial and ICE incarceration in other states. Additionally, Believers Bailout continues to assist those confronting the challenges of electronic monitoring and those we've bailed out through the various forms of post-release support. This includes ensuring folks are able to make their court dates on time, simply showing up for court support, and providing social and religious resources. And for those of you that are interested in our work, just make sure to follow us on social media, stay up to date on our upcoming programs and volunteer opportunities. And as you also know, Believers Bailout also attempts to host programs like this, such as the one that we're having today. Specifically, the discussion that we have for today aims to address how our incarcerated kin have been on the front lines of anti-colonial and liberatory struggles, from the Attica Prison Rebellion to Palestine, Guantanamo, and the Pelican Bay hunger strikes. The moderators for today's conversation are Mariam Kashani and Shireen Hamza. Mariam Kashani is an associate professor of gender and women's studies and Asian American studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's also a member of the Believers Bailout's national leadership. And just last week, we actually held a great conversation. BBO held a great conversation, virtual conversation with Mariam on her book, Medina by the Bay, Scenes of Muslim Study and Survival, which examines the Muslims' histories and practices in the Bay Area and ways Islam has been mobilized towards abolition, especially in the face of racial, capitalist, carceral, and genocidal logics. Our other moderator for today is Shireen Hamza. Shireen Hamza is a scholar and artist in Chicago. She is currently working as a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern, where she teaches and pursues her research on the history of science and medicine in the medieval Islamic world. Since 2017, Shireen has been involved in prison education projects, including the Prison Neighborhood Arts Education Project, or PNAP, in Chicago, where she has taught courses and reading groups, co-organized lectures, and facilitated research projects with the other PNAP alumni. Mariam and Shireen are going to be facilitating the conversation between our esteemed guests for today, Dr. Walaa Quisay and Dr. Orisanmi Burton. Dr. Walaa Quisay is a scholar at the University of Edinburgh and a scholar of religious studies with a focus on contemporary Islam and interdisciplinary expertise in the sociology and anthropology of religion. Her research comprises the study of the transformative impact of crisis on meaning-making practices of Muslim communities, ethical formations, ritual performance, and ultimately burgeoning selfhoods. Dr. Orisanmi Burton is a social anthropologist working in the US whose research examines the imbrication of grassroots resistance and state repression, exploring the collision of Black-led movement for social, political, and economic transformation with state infrastructures on militarized policing, surveillance, and imprisonment. Dr. Burton's groundbreaking book, Tip of the Spear, has actually been listed as contraband in prisons across the country, not only preventing incarcerated people from accessing the book, but punishing them further if found in their possession. In his letter on the censorship of his book, Burton writes, quote, "The real issue is not that my book may incite riots, but that your hold on power is so fragile, so tenuous, so devoid of legitimacy, that mere words on a page may be enough to make your cages of concrete and steel go up in flames. So with that being said, I'm going to hand things over to our facilitators for today, Mariam and Shireen.
Thank you so much, Shireen Yusuf, for helping to get this event going. I'm really excited to have this conversation. It's a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while after I read both Orisanmi's and Walaa's work. And we're actually going to be starting with a brief discussion of Ori's book that came from a brother Jarrell that a couple of us have gotten to know through our work with Stateville Prison here in the Chicagoland area. Although Jarrell has recently been moved, I'm going to pass it on to Shireen to do a proper introduction of Jarrell and to read his beautiful words.
Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everyone. We at Believers Bailout got to know Jarrell through a weekly visitation to Stateville Prison for the Friday prayers, the Jum'ah prayers. And I also got a chance to meet Jarrell previous to that through the Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Project. And PNAP actually organized a chance for Jarrell to engage directly with Dr. Burton and to respond to his work. So I will briefly read a passage from that letter that Jarrell wrote for one of the book events that Dr. Burton had in Chicago. And I will also at some point be happy to share Jarrell's comments on Dr. Quisay's article on hunger strikes, which we read together this summer, and Jarrell wrote a very moving reflection of which I can only share an excerpt here. So we'll begin this event after the name of God with these comments from Jarrell Matthews, who is now has been transferred to Shawnee Correctional Center, 6 hours south of Chicago. My name is Jarrell, which appropriately means ruler of the spear. I'm from Auburn Gresham, a community on the southwest side that is dominated politically, exploited economically, segregated, and traumatized. I'm a father, brother, poet, and abolitionist who has been blessed with the opportunity to read your publication, Tip of the Spear, while situated on the front line of the war you speak so eloquently about. This book has been extremely useful to me because it reveals the inception of the tactics that are deployed physically and psychologically upon me and those who I'm in struggle with. Your analysis in Chapter 5 enhanced my ability to define and articulate the non-physical violence and exploitation those of us held captive in Stateville Prison are currently experiencing under the guise of reform. Acquiring the capacity to recognize and explain pacification, along with the interlocking strategies of expansion, humanization, diversification, and programification from a historical context to fellow captives and to those who are not in bondage, has sharpened my political education work spear. I appreciate you, my brother, and I ask that you continue using your narrative power with the intention to destroy diabolical dungeons built for mental and physical destruction, create life-giving systems, and fundamentally alter people by emboldening them and removing their passivity. I ask the audience to be mindful not to inflict social death upon the incarcerated. Prisons are places where those inside are forgotten or ignored. Prejudice regarding the incarceration is naturalized in society. The wielders of power depend on this. Prison walls exist for the obvious reasons, but also the non-obvious reason of keeping the public out. In struggle, Jarrell.
Thank you, Shireen. Actually, so maybe we can start with Orisanmi, if you would like to respond to Jarrell's comments and at the same time add to say a little bit more about what your book is about for folks who haven't been able to read it just yet.
Sure. Thank you all so much for having me and for starting with Jarrell's letter. It's powerful. You know, he captured a lot in a very small amount of time and did so quite eloquently. Um, and you know, just to jump right in, it reminds me a lot of I've been reading a lot about and as much as I can of the martyred former Palestinian political prisoner Walaa Daka. You know, who's a was incarcerated in 1986 as a political militant, but was also a writer and a theorist of the Palestinian liberation struggle and of the specific role of political prisoners in that struggle. Much of his work isn't translated to English, so I haven't read most of it. But he's got this one essay, "Consciousness Molded," or the re-identification of torture, and he's talking specifically about what Jarrell's talking about as well, about the role of incarceration, not just to confine people geographically, not just to incapacitate their bodies, but to remold their consciousness through techniques and technologies that are very difficult to see and name because they don't register immediately as violence or as brutality. And so this sort of dynamic that Jarrell is talking about is actually one of the primary techniques of incarceration more broadly and globally, and fits into a broader um, pattern of counterinsurgency. But again, it can be very difficult to describe. And so that's what I was trying to do in that chapter, is name it. And it was a real honor to hear from someone who's inside, who's thinking about this stuff very clearly, that it helped him sort of sharpen his spear, as he mentioned. My book is about the radical prison movement in New York. People say that it's about prisons, and to some extent it is, but primarily it's about a tradition of Black radical philosophy that was incarcerated as a technique of preventing that philosophy from spreading to the masses, right? And so the prison is really a reaction to the philosophy and the praxis of Black revolutionaries. And so it really situates the prison in that historical perspective as a response to liberatory movements. And so I do that really by focusing on the well-known but poorly understood Attica Prison Rebellion of 1971, and argue that it wasn't just a 4-day rebellion, that it was really a distended, temporally distended, geographically dispersed rebellion across prisons and jails all throughout New York State and beyond, and that there was an internationalist component to that rebellion. And then I try to show how the prison evolved in response to this movement. And so ultimately, the argument is that prisons need to be understood as a domain of war, and that technologies that often get understood as reform or benevolent reforms, when understood in the context of war, take on a new character. And I think that's what Jarrell is responding to, and that's also what Walaa Daka is talking about as well.
I can jump in here and just read the comments that I mentioned before about Dr. Quisay's article, Dr. Quisay's article on hunger strikes, just so that we can get both authors in conversation. So thinking with Walaa Quisay's article, hunger strikes have always been a form of resistance since I've been incarcerated, and I'm sure before that as well. I think it's a different dynamic in the US than in the Middle East. I think, so just to clarify, this is Jarrell's writing. So if we could bring his photograph back up, that'd be amazing. I think it's a different dynamic in the US than in the Middle East. The hunger strikes I've participated in, nobody actually had any plans of starving themselves for various reasons. First, we knew that being in a weak physical state from actually not eating left you vulnerable not to be able to defend yourself from the cowardly COs who may try to run into your cell and assault you during the hunger strike. Also, with the poor health care and lack thereof, the last thing one wanted to do was become ill. Personally, starving yourself to death is not an act of resistance because you ultimately allow the state to claim victory. Every tactic they use is meant to destroy you. We would be very calculated when planning a hunger strike. Everyone would be made aware of when we would begin, and before we began, everyone would spend money at the prisoner commissary, stocking up on food items, so that once the hunger strike began, we could feed ourselves and each other. The hunger strike would consist of no prisoner accepting any of the trays provided by the state for breakfast, lunch, and dinner until our needs were met. This method worked for years, getting our grievances heard and met, until inmates informed the prison administration on how we were strategically operating. Once they found out, they would shake our cells down and confiscate all food items. Then it became a war of attrition, who would break first, and this disrupted our organizational unity. Many people broke. Recently, here at Stateville, a hunger strike took place for recreation time that was being denied to prisoners. It was successful, but when they gave rec time, the administration canceled schooling for 2 weeks out of the month in order to run recreation. This is a form of repression for the hunger strike, and it also pitted prisoners who are in school against those who are not, a divide and conquer tactic. Thinking of hunger strikes in the Middle East and whether it is unlawful to participate, I lean towards the intentions of the striker, which only Allah truly knows. The verses of the Quran can and are being manipulated. And here he's talking about prison administration, prison guards. I'm in complete agreement that not resisting tyranny and oppression is a form of destruction in and of itself. Freedom is more than the physical. As Muslims, we stay the course and fight with mind, body, and soul. And as Allah says, with hardship comes ease. So maybe we can pass it over to Dr. Quisay for a response.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I hadn't heard his comments before, so this was really, really enlightening for me. I think what's very interesting about this is how the specificity of each circumstance really dictates the manner in which people choose to resist. So, for example, initially when Sultan went on his hunger strike, the prison administration was not used to this much disruption within the infrastructure of the prison. But later it developed tools to navigate and deal with prisoners' hunger strikes. And so it was less likely for someone going on a long-term hunger strike to actually achieve what they had intended to achieve. And so different types of strikes became more useful. This particular strike that he'd mentioned is a very, very great example of how networks of solidarity within different prisons can actually sort of disrupt the whole infrastructure of the prison, meaning that like refusing the food of the prison authorities and rather relying on sometimes prisoners would refuse visitations or rec time mentioned. And this goes back to Ori's point that being in prison and navigating, and also not just navigating, but making claim as to what is your right as a person is all a part of this war of attrition. And the methods differ depending on the time. Sometimes some methods are useful and other times they're not. What was really interesting for me, however, was the role of religion in all of this. So religion is used by the prisoners, or it's not used by the prisoners, it's a part of their modes of resistance. It's a part.
Did we lose Walaa there?
I think so.
Okay. Well, hopefully she can come back and finish what she was saying. But I guess we can. Oh wait, here she is. Are you?
Okay. Did you guys?
Yeah, but it sounds like you're still dropping out.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to?
Okay. I don't. What did I stop? Sorry.
It was just the last sentence.
Yeah. So as I was saying, yeah, religion is very much at the heart of this war of attrition, but essentially the prisoners at the end are able to understand and realize that this instrument is not, even though it's mobilized against them, it doesn't really impact their faith in any way, that their faith is something that's separate from the state's mobilization of religion. And that every state, even like at some point, the Israeli state was actually able to bring in chaplains in order to say the same things that the Egyptian state had been saying, that, you know, hunger strikes are a form of suicide. And Khadra Adnan, who actually passed away while I was writing this article from his hunger strike in Israeli prisons, had made the statement, let me see if I can translate it. The person who's sitting, al-Qa'id, can't make a fatwa for the mujahid. So this form of hunger strike is a form of jihad, and someone who is sitting down and who's not actively engaging in this battle cannot make a fatwa for a mujahid.
If I could jump in just briefly, you know, the question, I think Jarrell is right that I mean, both of you are right in the way that hunger strikes don't typically unfold in the same way here in the United States as they do in the Middle East. Part of what is interesting about the hunger strike as a political form is that it speaks to the intense asymmetry of power, the almost total control that the carceral regime exercises over people's bodies and their ability to move around. Now, if we think about that in relation to what Walid Dr was talking about, and this shift away maybe from the body and towards targeting the soul, like and the consciousness, transforming the Palestinian subject into something that's more useful for Zionist colonialism, then the refusal to eat is a way of defending one's will internally, of protecting. All right, it's like it's saying, okay, we have no autonomy over what you do to us physically, but for me to physically resist eating, which goes against everything my body wants me to do, is in fact to nurture and strengthen and replenish the thing that is inside of me, my spirit, my will. And so it's a profoundly different form of resistance. It also exercises agency over how the suffering will be experienced. Because in that way, if you're refusing to eat, you're actually in many ways robbing prison authorities of their capacity to torture you.
Yeah.
Because you have taken agency over how your suffering will unfold. And so it really does speak to this tremendous asymmetry of power. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of something in your book, Walaa, with Qureshi, about how prisoners would also like respond with like when they're being asked to take off their clothes, right? That there was a refusal about that,
Yeah.
right? I'm not going to do that for you, right? And in one case, he rips up his pants, right?
Yeah.
Rather than make it easy for them and to authorize their power and authority and agency, as Orisanmi is saying, right? To have some claim to autonomy over what they're experiencing.
Yeah. I think, I mean, in a way, the very story of faith, and I don't want to reduce faith to just people exercising agency, but there's a huge element of that. The fact that, you know, the methods of control ranging, and not just ranging, but predominantly lying in things like preventing prisoners from going to the toilet. You know, when you prevent someone from going to the toilet, it could be even more detrimental than preventing them from eating. That's one of the biggest methods of control, to preventing them from sunlight, all these things. And the way that the prisoners try to engage in a deepened study of and debate of like fiqhi principles is a way of saying that you're trying to control my very inner being, my very inner ability to practice what I am, and I'm going to find a way in order not to not to succumb to that. I'll find my own method. And I think the even with hunger strikes, the communal element of it, and the ability to sort of create networks of solidarity is one of the most disorienting things for the prison authorities. If you're able to tell, you know, the world about your hunger strike and just show the violent brutality of the prison regime, it can connect people outside prison to those inside prison. Going on a collective hunger strike has this ability to, again, create this network of people within prison to fight this war together. And it becomes really, really disorienting for the state. And the way that they respond can be very, very violent. But with every violence, it kind of shows the world. It makes them basically naked. It makes their instruments of power appear a lot weaker than 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 they'd like to show it to the world. Like going back to Khadr Adnan, you know, he was on hunger strike in Israeli prisons for a very, very long time, and just the sheer inability of the prison authorities to deal with this man who's going on this hunger strike just shows you that, you know, this reclamation of agency is, it could really, really disorient the state. Now states obviously find ways to navigate it later on, but it's always very, very disorienting. Yeah, and the last thing I think I'll say about all of this is one of the practices that I found really, really touching. And I saw this in Guantanamo, Egypt, and other prisons around the world, where prisoners try to find a way to pray communally, even if they're in solitary confinement. So how do you even defy the sensory and spatial isolation where you line up, you know, across cells and try to pray in congregation? And again, that's one way the prison authorities try to control the prisoners and try to sort of quash their ability to connect with one another. And just the ability to do dua together, it just becomes a very, very powerful and even if at times implicit tool. It really does disorient the prison authorities. And that's why the prison authorities in Gitmo, for example, were very much trying to control the prisoner's ability to make wudu, the prisoner's ability to pray, because they really, really feared that aspect of their personhood.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's so much here, and well, that when you were both speaking, I'm also reminded of how the current genocide that we're witnessing has a way of connecting the conversation of what prison rebellion and resistance looks like, and how we understand Palestinian rebellion and resistance, and how any sort of effect of the Israeli offensive forces, right, can't kill that spirit, right? Can't kill that like striving to live as Palestinians on their land, right? That there can't be a military response to that in some ways, that it can't, right, speak to that. And I think there's that another part of that is also the communal aspect of that, right? That people more often than not are not going to turn each other in, are going to maintain their relationships with each other, even at their own personal loss. So I don't know if either of you would want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I can say that there are two aspects to this. Firstly, we need to think about how the structures of incarceration within Israel is very much connected to the structures of incarceration here in the States, but also in the Middle East. And so there is a huge symmetry within the logics of both places. If I would just like link the existence of this particular structure within the Israeli context and compare it to the Middle East, the prison exists in order to discipline the communities outside. And so everyone in Palestine knows someone that's been to prison. And actually, a lot of what's going on now, the prehistory of it is the history of incarceration. So the structure of the prison is very much there to make sure that people stay in line and people do not engage in particular forms of activism or political action that can sort of threaten the status quo in any way, but also it goes to humiliate societies and communities. And there's a similar sort of logic going on with sort of dictatorships in the Middle East, that the prison structure is there to tell you that if you step out of line, then you'll see the wrath of the state. That's on the side of the prison authorities. And of course, there's sort of like security arrangements. The prisons are built in very similar ways. There is the techniques of torture. They share intel, and there's a wide and long history on that. But even on the side of the prisoners also share strategies, read each other's stories, kind of have a common language. I think a really touching thing is to, like, one of the experiences that I found really, really touching was sort of seeing prisoners that have been incarcerated in different countries and under different circumstances talk to each other about their experiences. And you can see that there is this unwritten language and jokes that they kind of share. And it shows that there's this nexus of like experiences that exist. But like, again, even back to the hunger strike case, a lot of the hunger strikers that I talked to in Egypt had shared not just sort of stories from prisoners in Palestine, but also techniques. So, for example, in one instance, and this wasn't in the article, the prison authorities tried to force feed one of my interlocutors, and they basically did it in order so that like when human rights organizations come to check up on him, that they'd find that his blood sugar levels were okay, and so to invalidate his hunger strike. And so one of the things he did was actually have his family reach out to a former hunger striker in Palestine. And the hunger striker in Palestine said, well, they're going to ask you to show a sample of your urine. If you put a little bit of nail varnish in your urine, it'll actually kind of mess with the chemicals in order to show your actual blood level before the force feeding happened. And so there are actual strategic tools that people have used in sort of how do we actively fight against the state. So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Quisay. Just to turn it over to Dr. Burton, I'd love also, in this conversation about the collective that is built through resistance to prison technologies. One of the terms that you use, Dr. Quisay, is technicians of power, to describe the people who, the scholars, both Muslim scholars, but also prison chaplains and others who kind of collaborate with the system and use Islam or other religious discourses to oppress. And that really reminds us also of Dr. Burton's work. I'd like to add a question onto what's already been said about the theorizing and theologies that are created from prison. Both the people who are on the front lines of this warfare, but also their responses to the kinds of suggestions and enforcement by these technicians of power. Over to you, Dr. Burton.
Sure. I mean, well, when we talk about prison rebellion, the first thing that comes to most people's minds is like a physical prison takeover, which of course is certainly a terrain of struggle that unfolds at various times and places across, and in different contexts. But I mean, there's different terrains of rebellion that are unfolding all the time and that often don't really register as rebellion at all. And so, narrative rebellion, the writing of incarcerated people's stories on their own terms and their struggles to get those narratives out, that's a terrain of rebellion. Intimacy, what Walaa was just talking about, figuring out how to be together in spite of and against the most sort of repressive techniques designed ultimately for a really old imperial concept, which is divide and conquer. So if divide and conquer is the essence of what the prison as a colonial technology does, then intimacy is a terrain of rebellion within that context. There's, the struggle for bodily autonomy and sovereignty. So there's all different kinds of struggles that are unfolding. And I wanted to come back to this earlier point about the sort of U.S. prison struggles and the international connections. Most of you will probably recall earlier this year, an incarcerated Black Muslim named Hamza in, I think, the California prison system donated less than $18, which was his wages that he earned through prison labor over, I think it was 136 hours of labor. He accumulated $17.74, which he then donated to relief efforts in Gaza. And this was picked up by the media and it went viral, and it was really narrated around this idea of charity and used, narrated as a potential symbol of his rehabilitation by the prison system. Like that's sort of how it was described. But I think it's more appropriately situated within this longer trajectory of Black and Palestinian solidarity, and the fact that some of the most powerful expressions of that solidarity have been across prison walls historically. So we could also think about George Jackson, who's a well-known Black revolutionary prisoner who was assassinated in 1971. And after he was assassinated, it was found that he had a book of poetry by Sami al-Qasim, and he had a Palestinian poet, and George had translated some of the poems into his own diary, such that journalists in the Black Panther newspaper thought that they were his poems, and so they published it as if it was his. Later, they found out that he didn't write it, and they revised their statement saying that, quote, in a larger sense, it was still written by Comrade George, for as George would say, we are all the enemies of those who are enemies of the sun, those who maintain this monstrous oppression of the people of this world, right? Of course, George's assassination inspires, in part, the Attica Prison Rebellion in New York, also in 1971. And in the wake of that rebellion, several of the incarcerated people wrote letters which they transmitted to people who were engaged in the anti-colonial struggle all around the world, and named, the Vietnamese, the Palestinians, people in Mozambique as inspirations. A month later, there's a massive prison rebellion in an Israeli prison. What's it? Oh, Ascalon prison. This happened about a month afterwards, and evidence suggests there, at least the Israeli prison administrator said that rebellion was an attempt at copying the big riot in Attica. So suggests that the sort of inspiration is going both ways. And of course, we know that, as Walaa mentioned, a lot of the techniques of repression are designed as part of a kind of an international conversation around repression, right? That takes place in trade journals. It takes place during these different visits where people will go to different prisons and do sponsorships. And so I've been doing, looking more into those relationships, and would be happy to talk more about that, but also don't want to take up too much time.
Walaa, do you want to add anything in response to what Ori just said?
No, I think Ori perfectly summarized. Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. Well, and I think sort of thinking about what we started off with, we're thinking about prisons as domains of war, and about them being both repressive in terms of maintaining a sense of kind of quote unquote law and order, at the same time that they are also very important technologies of counterinsurgent warfare. I'd love to hear both of you talk about that, especially in these contexts where there's a picture painted of a kind of domestic sphere and an international sphere, whereas what we see, especially from the cage, from the cell, from the camp, is that people are always making these connections, that we are in solidarity and we are also one in the same, and that these things are all related. So either one of you.
I think so. It's really, really interesting because people go into prison being different people, and then they're socialized in particular ways, and often they get to meet people they wouldn't have otherwise met within that structure. And so prison has this particular ability to create a different person. And by saying that the prison authorities have this ability, or try to create a different person, but also the sense of camaraderie and solidarity, and even infighting that sometimes happen amongst prisoners, really does go to impact people's consciousness. So many people don't enter prison as sort of thinking of themselves as political agents, but the actual reality of incarceration does politicize you in a way that that might not be seen as conventional politics, but it is politics nonetheless. So, for example, one of the things that I noticed, or that I've seen within the Egyptian prisons, there is this distinction between political and quote unquote criminal prisoners, and it's a legal distinction in a way that, like, those people that were incarcerated for political crimes usually come into prison under a terror accusation. So usually the very typical crime that they would go into prison is joining a terrorist organization and disseminating false information. These are the two accusations. And with that, they're framed as a political prisoner, right? And then people who come in with under different circumstances are usually put in different cells, but sometimes they're placed together. And I think what was really, really interesting to me is looking at the relationships these two so-called independent groups develop between one another. So one thing a former prisoner had noted to me is that the prison authorities were actually more afraid at the politicization of people that came in with criminal offenses. So if they were caught reading, for example, if they were caught praying, if they were caught doing any activity that seemed to have any intellectual dimension to them, they'd be punished a lot more harshly than people who are framed as political, because if you're political, then you probably went to high school or university, and so you had the political consciousness. So it was more about controlling other aspects of your socialization. So in a sense, the space of the prison has this ability, because you see the naked power of the state, and you see the naked power of the state victimizing people for no other reason other than control. A kind of political consciousness develops, and it's a very, very powerful political consciousness, because it kind of sees the instruments of power in its most naked forms. And so, yeah, that's sort of one thing that really, really struck me, is how prison has this ability to politicize, and how our understanding of what the political is on the outside typically does not really fall into the same paradigms as what political socialization really looks like on the inside.
Yeah, I could jump in here. I mean, it's interesting. The U.S. context is interesting because the United States represents itself as a uniquely sort of liberal democratic kind of formation. And so there's no official category of political prisoner in the US. Officially, the United States has never had any political prisoners. It's something that they've always disavowed. Um, what state actors who manage and legitimize prisons will say is that we have a criminal justice system, and people who violate the law are incarcerated under those standards, irrespective of what the ideology behind that was. Now, that changed a little bit after September 11th, but overall, but even in those cases, those people who are, there's the term, enemy combatant that's used there, which is a depoliticizing term, which in some ways is very similar to the term, security prisoner, which is used in Israel when, people are accused of committing crimes that have, quote, nationalistic aims. But in the United States, there is a very sophisticated, very coordinated set of legal processes and procedures which facilitate political repression through the bureaucracy of law enforcement, which do not register as political incarceration at all. And so there's a veneer there's a veneer of sort of legitimacy and due process that overlays what ultimately is a series of techniques that were developed in global laboratories of counterinsurgency. So just as one example, you know, your organization is focused on bail, right? The official purpose of bail is to hold someone who's deemed too dangerous to be let out before trial. But in all contexts of counter-revolutionary warfare, historically, there's been a practice of essentially preventive detention, which is to just take certain categories of people who would be most likely to engage in militant political struggle out of circulation preemptively. The US doesn't officially do that, but unofficially, for instance, through the counterintelligence program, which was the FBI's illegal program for neutralizing militants, especially black militants and revolutionaries on the left, there's documents where former FBI J. Edgar Hoover directly talks about, we need to take these people out of circulation. We're going to hold them in jail. They were in jail for 2 years. They were later found that they were not guilty of anything, but at least we took them off the street for 2 years, right? So an admission that the prison is being used to operate outside of its official charter, right? And so in many ways, the criminal justice framework and that language is misleading. But the problem is that there's such a sophisticated propaganda apparatus arrayed around normalizing and naturalizing the discourses of criminal justice and rehabilitation and these things, which many of the state actors who are thinking about war know aren't the true function. But there's so much propaganda around that in the US. Think about the hundreds, literally hundreds of cop shows and the however many versions of Law and Order there are, that the level of consciousness around the political function of the prison in the United States is relatively low, especially compared to where it was 50 years ago. And to some extent that's changing. But even the radical sort of leftist discourses around what prisons are in some ways misleading and shaped by an unsophisticated and undialectical understanding of where prisons come from. And when I say undialectical, I mean it's an understanding that does not center the role of collective revolutionary mobilization in necessitating the development of prisons to contain social movements. Once we understand that dynamic, then I think our overall understanding of what prisons are and what a political prisoner is will change. But until we continue to operate within a criminal justice framework and take that framework on its own terms and adopt and deploy the language and narratives that are encouraged through that framework, we're going to find ourselves reaching conclusions that don't conclude, as Fred Hampton used to say.
Before we move on, Dr. Quisay, would you like to add anything about the way Dr. Burton's been speaking about the purpose of bail? I know you also touch on pretrial incarceration in your work.
So I think you cut off. Sorry, I didn't hear the end of the question. I'm sorry.
No worries. I was just asking if you wanted to say a little bit more about how you touch on pretrial incarceration in your work.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, pretrial incarceration, or in Israel, it's typically framed as administrative detention, is precisely a way to keep people in prison for an unknown and unspecified amount of time it's basically the most important tool of like the war on terror in order to abduct and incarcerate people without giving them access to defend themselves, without giving them due process at all, even if the very notion of due process is not applicable in these circumstances. And in my work, at least, with a few things. Firstly, it's the idea of being able to criminalize and abduct a population without really knowing or having any concrete sort of claims to why you're doing this. So you don't need a pretext for their so-called criminality in order to keep them in pretrial detention. It goes hand in hand with rendition programs that the U.S. has been involved in for many, many, many years, even before the war on terror, where people are kept or people are sent to countries where they can be interrogated for an unspecified amount of time. And there's sort of no legal repercussions to potentially tortured. I mean, in Egyptian prisons, there are people that have been sort of sent to Egypt by the U.S. for decades, and they're just lingering in prisons there without due process and are in pretrial detention. So when I say that pretrial detention, it's that instrument. So the one thing you need to understand about it is that when the state declares a war on terror, they're basically saying that there is an emergency or a possible invisible enemy that they're fighting within the state. And so to keep the population safe, these people need to be incarcerated until we figure out the problem. So that kind of explains why there isn't a particular amount of time. So within Egyptian law, at the beginning, the pretrial detention was capped to 2 years, but with war on terror legislation, it's basically the amount of time you could spend in pretrial detention is indefinite, and so that allows for the mass incarceration of populations. So it's connected to that. It's also connected to in states of enforced disappearance. Renditions are a form of enforced disappearance because sometimes the state, because you're an enemy of the state, because you're a combatant, because you're a threat or a potential threat, the state cannot tell your family or acknowledge your existence within the system because the system of rendition is not even acknowledged on an official level. So what you have is people in states of enforced disappearance under pretrial detention with no sort of legal oversight as to their conditions. And so usually pretrial detention is the worst place you can be because there's no limits to what can happen to you in that space. There is no time that you will be let out, and there's no mechanisms, and there's no legal, you have no access to sort of legal aid in any way possible. So you're basically stuck there. And so pretrial detention alongside solitary confinement are the two worst instruments, I think, that the prison authorities use to punish a population.
Thank you both. I think as we're winding down, we wanted to give an opportunity for folks to ask questions who are watching. And we do have a question from Instagram, and if that person will forgive me to add a little element to this. The question is, how do Islamic teachings inform approaches to justice and resistance against oppressive carceral systems? And what are the most integral Islamic praxis in this context? I wanted to add a question, I think, because it came up earlier in the comments too. Orisanmi, you're speaking to Black radical philosophies, which are both within and in excess of Islamic sort of liberatory philosophies, theologies. And so I would just love for you both to think with that question together about, right, like approaches to justice, resistance, praxis, survival.
I can start off because this isn't my area, but I'm working on putting together an edited volume of the unpublished writings of Dhoruba bin Wahad, who was a leading figure in the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party and an architect of the Black Liberation Army, who took his shahada in Clinton Prison, the solitary confinement unit called Unit 14 in 1968. When I asked him to tell me about that experience, first, just as I'm going to answer the question, but I think this is relevant. When I asked him to tell me about that experience, because I had heard a lot about Unit 14, which is a torture chamber. It's probably the worst place you can be, definitely in New York, but one of the worst prison carceral sites in the country. He said that if you go on YouTube and look up a documentary about the prison at Bahrain Air Force Base in Afghanistan, he said they had these rows of little cages where you could enter from the front or from the rear. That's what Unit 14 was like, you know. And so we can't prove this, but he thinks that it was a similar kind of design, like the same designer perhaps. Elsewhere, and I talk about this in my book about different kinds of experiments at psychological control that were happening. Dhoruba said to me that Guantanamo Bay is the sum total of what they've been doing to Muslims in prisons in the United States for decades, right? So again, talking about this continuity of repression. So it was in this context that he took his shahada, and once he started to really read and study the Quran, what inspired him the most was that it gave a sort of a universal language and a universal validity to principles that he had already internalized and believed to be true when he was young and when he was in the Black Panther Party, and specifically the passages in the Quran which enjoin followers of Islam to fight against injustice. And so that for him gave new meaning again and a new in transnational sort of purchase to the modes of resistance that he had long engaged in. So I'm still working on transcribing that interview and elaborating it, and hopefully I'll have more to say on it in the future, but that's what I can share at this time. Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Walaa, did you want to add anything around this Islamic practice and Islamic praxis?
I think, is everything frozen?
No, we can...
It's just this, my screen froze for a minute. My screen froze for a minute, that's all. You can hear me? Yeah, there's a lot to say about this, a lot to say. And actually, I don't know where to start, but I think the one really, really striking to me is how we have in our sort of tradition a long history of carceral theology that hasn't been mapped out at all, meaning that almost me. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, you just have a bit of a drag. If you want to turn off your camera.
Yeah. So okay, perfect. Yeah, when I was working in just Islamic thought before I delved into sort of carceral theology, I think the one thing that was striking to me is the amount of intellectual discourse, liberatory intellectual discourse that had a prehistory in incarceration, meaning that most of the sort of thinkers in the 20th century have had some sort of experiences with the prison system that shaped their discourse in one way or another. And there is a kind of I wouldn't say unwritten, but not deeply discussed or theorized understanding of why the prison system exists, of how incarceration changes a person, and how we ought to, as a society, deal with the state, and the state being, in a way, an extension of the prison. And this is true for like Islamic thinkers. It's true for a lot of the like poetry that was developed in sort of the Muslim majority world or in the 20th century. So it's really, really, really prevalent. But I think the moment that really struck me was when I was interviewing Sheikh Dadu from in my hunger strike article, and I had asked him about hunger strikes. I was just getting his religious perspective. I hadn't really delved into his own political journey or his political history. And he started out by saying, I was imprisoned in Mauritania for 3 years. And he said, you're not going to get this, but prison is a form of war, and it's a war on 3 fronts. It's a spiritual war, it's a psychological war, and it's a physical war. It's a psychological war in the sense that they will try to undo your own personhood in order to make you more malleable. It's a religious war in that they fight you in your ability to conduct prayers and to be a functioning servant of God. And it's a physical war in that they engage in torture against you. And then he mentioned that prisons in their shape as we see them are not Sharia compliant institutions, but also the very notion of incarceration and prisons were not something that were integral to like early Islamic understanding of punishment and criminality. It's something that came later on, and there hasn't been a deep discussion into how it was an instrument of the modern state to kind of discipline society in that way. So this was something that he said. This was something that another scholar that I talked to had said. And it seemed to me that there was an implicit understanding that the prison system as it stands doesn't really make sense within an Islamic context at all. So yeah, I mean that's sort of on a macro theorization level, but on a sort of micro level, yeah, the prison system has been in sort of the bloodline of Islamic thinking, especially liberatory thinking, throughout the 20th and the 21st 21st century. It's just we haven't really done as much work as we should to sort of untangle and understand the way that that criminalization of people has sort of really created a mass political consciousness.
Thank you, Dr. Quisay. So I just wanted to briefly shout out this co-authored book because I don't think we got a chance for Dr. Quisay to explain the project. But When Only God Can See: The Faith of Muslim Political Prisoners by Walaa Quisay and Asim Qureshi. It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful project. It's been incredible to have both of you in both of these authors and these works in conversation. And before we just go to the final two questions from our audience, and thank you all for being here with us in this moment, I just want to flag for our last question, how many chapters of Dr. Quisay's book about the prayers of prisoners, the belief in crisis chapter, many of the Ummah of prisoners, many of these chapters really do respond directly to this question of what resources Islam really has to offer for our current struggle and resistance. One thing I think both texts really investigate, both Dr. Burton's text and Dr. Quisay's, both of her books, investigate this deification of the security state, the sort of conflation of, and so what spiritual challenges that leads to, I think, are quite creatively and beautifully answered by many of her interlocutors and many of Dr. Burton's as well. Mariam, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to, because I know folks have things they need to get to. So I'm sorry, we're probably not going to be able to get to the last questions, but I wanted to give Dr. Burton, Dr. Quisay a chance to sort of say some last words. There are questions around what are the roles of prison uprisings, what are the resistance strategies that we need to deploy, and things along those lines. And especially for folks who want to be in solidarity, like what are the things that we need to attend to, not overlook?
Thank you. This has been a really rich conversation. I think it's a big kind of closing question. I'm not quite sure how to attack it at this moment. I think that part of what I try to do in my work is, and it's not enough. Like there's so much that we need to be doing. Part of what I try to do in my work is to try to elevate the modes of analysis that have grown out of these conditions of extreme repression and duress that we've been talking about, based on the understanding, and we didn't get to talk about this, but the Black radical analysis of prisons is very similar to how people in Palestine and elsewhere think about the prison, which is not that the prison is exceptional to a given society, but that it is actually the paradigm of how society works, that prisons are compressed distillations of the power relationships that exist outside in the so-called free world. And so in that way, the prison becomes a method for thinking about how to resist oppressive regimes in really concrete ways. And so that's the work that I've been trying to do, is to elevate the modes of analysis that have developed under those conditions, but there's a tremendous amount of things that people can do, joining prisoner solidarity organizations, writing and being connected with people in prisons, which has historically acted as somewhat of a shield against more heinous forms of abuse. It is the case, especially in the United States, that if prison officials know that you're connected to someone, they know that you have people on the outside, that can in some ways help shield you from some forms of abuse. And so being connected with people, doing prisoner solidarity work, finding alternative sources of information where you don't, which don't allow you to get sort of drowned in the state propaganda. I mean, these are all sort of daily practices that we can engage in. And of course, joining organizations where you can think collectively with other people, like Believers Bailout and so many others. So it's been a real pleasure to have this conversation. And thank you.
Thank you. And if you need to run, we can continue. But I really want to thank Dr. Burton for being here with us. And we'll have you back, and hopefully with Dhoruba. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Burton.
It was really, really nice to have met him. I think the one thing I would say is that prisons, in the way that they organize themselves, they feed off invisibility and erasure. And it's not just the invisibility of people that are incarcerated right now, even though that is the massive sort of thing, but like the histories of people, there is this keen desire to make it seem these things are exceptional, or they don't matter, or it's separate from society. But again, the instruments of violence are about the people on the outside as much as they are about the people on the inside. So like if we think about the Palestinian case, we are seeing the genocide unfolding right now, and the invisible sort of crimes that are committed in Israeli prisons are very much have everything to do with the genocide that is going right now. You can't tell these stories separately at all. And sighing a sigh of relief because we don't get to see it, because it's not on tape, is a really, really if you want to truly build a movement, it's a huge faux pas. So I think it's really, really important to fight erasure in every way possible, and just developing a wider understanding of prisons and their instruments of violence can really help us when mobilizing any movement. But also obviously trying to develop networks of support for people that are incarcerated right now, taking care of their families. That's also a huge, massive thing that we need to be actively involved in. The children of prisoners and the traumas that they face, and sort of being a resource to the families is something that's just really, really, really important. So yeah, I think that's, just a few things that we can do to be of service, I guess.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quisay. I just want to add before we close that for anyone listening who is not in touch with an incarcerated person, whether you're based in the US or elsewhere, we have a program. We're in touch with several pen pal programs, and we can direct you to those depending on who you are and where you're based and what you're looking for. And As Jarrell said at the beginning of this event, as we read his words, that his message to us was not to let prisons be a site of social death, to not let us be separated. And so in addition to all of the suggestions that Dr. Burton and Dr. Quisay gave us, let us help you. Let us bring you into the organizing that we're doing. We need you. We need your support, whether as a pen pal, as someone who shows up for court support here in Chicago or elsewhere, who mobilizes your masjid, to bring dates to the Muslims at your local prisons, wherever you are in Ramadan. Start building these connections and making sure that incarcerated siblings are part of your community.
And thank you both, Shireen, Walaa, and Dr. Burton in absentia. And thank you all for joining and for your questions and for your attention. I think all of us have been thinking a lot about what it means to be witnesses in this moment, and to be ongoing witnesses, and the responsibility to witness, right? As well as saying, like, oftentimes we tend to think of prisons and jails, or tend to not think and not see them, right? But as Dr. Burton is saying, that they are integral to our societies, and the way they function and the way power is dispersed within them. So what does it mean to continue to witness? And I think this is a question that Believers Bailout is constantly thinking with and trying to activate, because to witness means to actually do something. That is one of the particularities of witnessing, right, in Islam, that, when we make a testimony, when we involve it's an action. It is not just something we do with our eyes. It is something we do with our whole beings. And that's something we're going to continue to be thinking with and working with folks around. There was so much more we wanted to talk about, but we also have limited time. We will be posting links to the books, the articles. Please follow us and follow Walaa and Orisanmi, and hopefully we will continue to have conversations with them. And we will see you soon, inshallah. Thank you.